In the classes we've been working with throughout the course, we've always been using what are called instance members. Right? Each class member is associated with a specific class instance. And that's what you normally want. But sometimes you want to be able to have a class member that's available class-wide, and that's where static members come in. So a static member is a class member that's not associated with any individual instance. Now, the way you declare static members is very similar to the way you declare instance members, except you include the keyword static. So a static field is declared just like a regular field, except you put the keyword static in front of it. Similarly, when declaring a static method. The thing is that when you create static members, because they're not associated with the individual instance, you can actually access them using the class name. So if you think about like a static field, so a static field would be a field whose value is not associated with any specific instance. It's class-wide. What that means is that each instance of the class will actually access the same value for that field. So a static method is usually a case where you have a method that wants to do some work that's not specific to any individual instance. Static methods can only access static fields. They can't access instance fields because, again, they're not associated with any individual instance. So let's take a look at using this in some code. So we've got our flight class we've been using throughout the course. And we know that one of the things we've done is keep track of the number of passengers. Right? So each flight can track how many people are on that one flight with the passengers field. We have this add one passenger method that increments the count there. Now let's say what we want to do now is that in addition to each flight keeping track of how many passengers are on that flight, we'd like to have an easy way to keep track of how many passengers are on the total of all flights. And that's a great use for a static field. So what we're going to do is add a field here called all passengers. Again, I declare it just like an instance field, but I've actually marked it with static. That now means it's not associated with any instance. I'll add some methods to work with it. I'll have a method here, get all passengers, and that'll simply return back the value of all passengers. So again, get all passengers is declared like any other method, except it's marked as static. And I also want to have the ability to set number of all passengers back to 0. So I have a method here called reset all passengers, which then just sets it to 0. So let's use this in some code. So we'll go out here, and let's say first of all, we want to just go ahead and reset all passengers. Now again, the key thing to understand in static members is that they are stored separate from any instance. Right? So the storage area for all passengers is outside of any instance of the flight class. Right? So if I go out here and I say print line flight.get all passengers, get all passengers will get the current value of all passengers, which of course is 0, and print that out. So now the question is how do I change the value of all passengers? How do I increment that? Because I want to increment it each time I add a passenger. Well, in our add one passenger method, just below where we increment passengers by 1, we'll go ahead and just simply add 1 to all passengers. See, we're not really interacting with it any differently. What's going to change its behavior is the way its storage is managed. Let's say we have now our flight LAX 045. So when we actually create an instance of the flight class, right, it has its own memory. Again, notice that that instance memory is separate from the all passengers memory. So if I go off and I say LAX 045, add one passenger, of course the passengers for the instance LAX 045 gets incremented by 1, as does all passengers. Right, so if I call add one passenger again on LAX 045, LAX 045 passengers increments by 1, as does all passengers. But now let's create another instance. We have our SLC 015. Of course, it has its own memory associated with it. So when I call add one passenger on SLC 015, passengers in SLC 015 increments by 1, going from 0 to 1, but all passengers keeps its old value. So it now goes from 2 to 3. You see that all passengers is continuing to count up even as we interact with it through different instances. Right? And that's where the power of statics come in. So now if I go ahead and print out the value of get all passengers, I get 3. So I'm not doing any extra work to keep this total value across all instances. Simply by declaring it as static gave me that ability. Now, as I mentioned, we can access static members by using the class name. But Java also has a shorthand for accessing static members called static import. And static import allows you to access static members without even using the class name. So it's really just kind of a shorthand mechanism. So we take a look at our code here, where we're using the flight class, and we were calling into reset all passengers and get all passengers. Well, rather than have to always say flight dot in front of it, we'd like to be able to just say reset all passengers or get all passengers. We'll use a static import to do that. So first one, I'm going to give us a little bit more room to work here. And so it's an import statement. So we're going to use an import at the top, right? Remember we used import earlier to actually be able to use shorthands for classes so we didn't have to package qualify them. Now we're going to use the import for shorthands for static members so we don't have to qualify them. So we have the word import. In this case, we include the word static. So this is a static import. We then give it the package name, dot the class name, which is our flight class, and then we also include the member name. So reset all passengers. So now where we say flight.reset all passengers, now that can simply become reset all passengers. Right? The import statement allows us to use just the method name. So the same thing for our get all passengers. I can have an import, static, the package name, dot the class name, in this case flight, dot the method name. So in each case there we now print out and call get all passengers. Instead of saying flight.getAllPassengers, we'll say get all passengers. Same thing in the other print statement. Right? So the static import just allowed us to type that more succinctly. In the next clip, we'll see some other usage and other behaviors of working with statics as we talk about static initializers.